Bom dia a todos presentes aqui na sala. É um grande prazer, uma enorme satisfação de tê-los todos aqui para celebrar os 60 anos da IPGE. Vamos começar a sessão daqui a pouco com o primeiro painelista, Prêmio Nobel, Jean Tirole. Daqui a pouco o Lucas Maestre vai introduzi-lo, vai ser o seu moderador. Antes, porém, gostaria de passar a palavra, né, para o coordenador em seguida, o Lucas, coordenador comigo desse evento, e depois o nosso diretor da escola, Rubens Penha Cisne. Esse evento celebra os 60 anos e é importante nós marcarmos esse momento, porque é muito difícil ter uma escola na liderança em economia num país como o Brasil, complexo, com todas as dificuldades que nós temos. E isso, para a gente, é uma grande honra ter construído ao longo desses 60 anos uma escola líder na América Latina, que tem transmitido conhecimento e desenvolvimento econômico no nosso país e influenciando muitas gerações de economistas em nosso país, acadêmicos e policymakers e pessoas que trabalham no mercado. Então, em virtude disso, nós vamos marcar esse momento com esse evento de 2 dias, em que teremos a presença de Jean Tirole, de John Cohrane, além de outros ex-alunos que apresentarão os seus trabalhos, ex-alunos que estão fazendo suas carreiras brilhantes no exterior, e também algumas sessões, mesas redondas, falando de temáticas que importam muito à realidade econômica do Brasil. Vou passar nesse momento ao Lucas Maestre para dar suas palavras iniciais e depois ao professor Rubens Penha Cisne, o nosso diretor.
Muito obrigado, Humberto. Muito obrigado, Rubens. Muito obrigado a todos que estão nos prestigiando. E, acima de tudo, parabéns à nossa escola. A gente hoje está completando, nesse ano estamos completando 60 anos, tá certo? 60 anos de muito trabalho, 60 anos para trazer conhecimento econômico para o Brasil. E um jeito de comemorar é fazer um debate, fazer um webinar, né? Um webinar de 2 dias, mas um webinar que, além de ter palestrantes fenomenais internacionais, como o Prêmio Nobel Jean Tirole, o professor John Cohrane. Esse webinar vai contar com grande parte de nossos ex-alunos, que têm tido carreiras muito boas, tanto na parte de pesquisa acadêmica, quanto na parte de policymaking no Brasil. Então, é uma grande honra fazer parte desse processo, fazer parte dessa construção de conhecimento e, no fim das contas, ajudar na missão que é ajudar a desenvolver um pouco a parte, o conhecimento econômico, em última instância, desenvolver o nosso país. Deixa eu agora passar a palavra para o nosso diretor, Rubens Cisne, que há muito tempo tem trabalhado para manter a EPGE na liderança do ensino econômico na América Latina. Muito obrigado a todos. Rubens.
Thank you, Lucas. Can you listen? Are you listening? Hello?
Eu estou, sim.
Okay. Humberto, are you listening? Okay. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank our speakers. I'd like to thank all of those who are joining us today on this occasion. And especially thanks to Lucas Maestri and Humberto for putting everything together. I apologize, my camera started not working suddenly, even though I had registered before to make sure everything would be okay. So these are things that happen. But I think that this date is a date in which we should think about 2 main things. Well, first of them, paying tribute to all those who have made possible this trajectory over these 60 years. And second thing, during the day, during these 2 days that we have ahead, to think about not only the past, but also about the future of our school. So this success to which Lucas and Humberto referred is certainly not a work of only one generation, let alone one person or two or even a small group. It's a work of several and several people. We have inherited a set of very nice coincidence, I would say, by means of which very hard working hours of several very talented people to this day, and not only in the past, have joined the school and have been with us and are with us to construct this precious treasure that we have, that is our institution. No anniversary of this institution should go without having us mention the name of its founder, Professor Mário Henrique Simonsen, to which we pay tribute today as well. I will not cite the name of anybody who is still among us, only those who belong to the silent majority, using the term that has been devised away before Nixon used that in 1973. So that's those who passed away. João Paulo dos Reis Veloso, Carlos Langoni. And the first day, 11 years ago, when I started as a director, I called Regina Luiz, who's now a secretary of the president, and asked her to make a call to Professor Ney Coy de Oliveira. Professor Ney Coy de Oliveira was neither a researcher nor actually a professor, but among those who were, Professor Mário Simonsen would have been the person with, of course, that I would have looked for talking, but he had passed away already. So I talked with Veloso and Langoni, and then I looked for Professor Ney in an idea to bring the past of the school. He belonged to the generation, 2 generations before my generation in the school, to get to know how the past, which were the past values that had allowed for that nice trajectory already to be achieved, and to reaffirm these values all over these years. So we are here not only to praise what has happened, but also to reaffirm the values of looking at best practice in the international arena, looking at the combination of research and teaching, looking at student and faculty exchange. These values have constructed this institution. These values are to be reaffirmed at this time. And actually, this was a type of a slingshot shooting. So when you throw something, you want to throw something into the future or to a certain distance, either you move your arm backwards to start with, or you move your slingshot backwards to reach the future. And that was what I did when I did this call to Professor Ney, as well to João Paulo dos Reis Veloso and Carlos Langoni. So if we have a target, which target is this? I would say the following. OECD has a very nice motto. They say, better policies for better lives. I think we could say better education for better lives as well. So if I had to summarize the purpose of our job, of our institution all over these years, I would say just this sentence: better education for better lives. So better lives where? Well, I would say all over the world. Because when we start educating people about general values that we should pursue, like going green, like in looking at the revolution that the new digital age has led to economics, and the proximity of the possibility of analyzing policies with more accuracy. So all these things, when we educate people for that, they have a worldwide range of consequences. So this is how I would summarize our mission. And we do have reasons to celebrate, as Lucas said. We managed to to be in first position in several different rankings. In 9 of the 13 evaluations conducted by our Ministry of Education among 2,100 institutions, in 9 times among 13, we have been placed the first. If you look at the exam all of economics, 200 institutions in Brazil, 3 times among 5, also the first place, not to mention the first place in Latin America, following the Tilburg Index of Economics. So this, of course, leads to a strong responsibility, because as we said, we have inherited all these nice conditions. We have managed to keep the school in a very good position. But as you know, it's difficult not only to reach the best positions, but to keep them. Yeah? So I would say that our responsibilities, now looking at the future, are immense. We have to keep this treasure going on, providing the students of our community the best possible education here in Rio de Janeiro, and now online all over several other places, even abroad. We have to be concerned with the fact that every institution has to be concerned the whole time, which is the financial sustainability. Tomorrow I'll mediate a session, and maybe I develop something about it, and keep contracting the best minds and attracting committed and the best students. So that's summarizes everything that we have been doing, and that I hope we are able to do. When I say the next 60 years, my friends say, well, wait a minute, 60 years planning ahead, maybe it's so well a bit too much. I say, well, okay, and not to mention that you are in a part of the world where things are not that stable and steady for you to plan with that. Okay, so if it's not for 60, let's say something that's over 15. But we are not driving a jet ski here. We have a transatlantic, which moves very slowly, but very steadily, persistently, with lots of prudency, of persistence, with moderacy as well. And that's what we have to try to keep for the future. So we have other challenges. Nowadays, we have already students going much more into data from the start in the undergraduate studies. We are still learning, scratching the surface about keeping an eye on values such as diversity, which something that we have to pursue, about educating people about the importance of the environment. Now we are developing new areas in undergraduate studies to focus, to have the students focusing on going green and the importance of that for the planet. And I confess that I do not have any idea of how could be measured the present value of having a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations of students getting the education to look at these values, to look at these problems, which are worldwide challenges. So it's a great pleasure to open this conference. I very warmly welcome all our former students, our invited guests, world-class renowned economists. I welcome our professors, members of the administrative body who have contributed to this session, as well as Lucas and Humberto, who have put a lot of time to have us today joining here. And I wish everybody the best possible day, the best possible conference for these days to come. Thank you very much, Humberto. Thank you very much, Lucas. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Rubens.
Acho que podemos começar, Lucas. Você pode começar a sessão.
Okay, so thank you, Humberto. Thank you, Rubens, and thank you all for attending this conference. So let me first start with a disclaimer. So the views here, the opinions here are the ones of the speakers and not the ones from FGV. And second, everyone since it's going to be broadcast, everyone here agrees to with their copyright images. So okay. Well, those are difficult times. We live in times of polarization. We live in times of a pandemic. We live in times of global warming, and in these times there are a lot of difficult questions. There are a lot of new problems, and those problems, as I said, they bring difficult questions. And to think about difficult questions, we need great minds. Hence, we invited Jean to come here and to help us a little bit shed some light into those difficult questions. Well, it's a great honor to have Jean here. Jean probably is totally needless to introduce him, but I should say that he has so many seminal contributions in economics, in industrial organization, two-sided markets, incentive theory, behavioral economics, banking, macroeconomics, etc. Probably, like, just to mention his seminal contributions, these 2 days wouldn't be enough. Well, but here today, Jean is going to talk us a little bit about moral, ethics, and markets. So before giving the floor to Jean, I just have to tell you that there is a place in Zoom for Q&As, and I'm asking everybody to everybody who wants to post a question at Q&A, and those questions will be some questions will be selected, and I'm gonna take these questions to Jean in the last 15 minutes of this talk. Jean, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Just a minor compliment. So the ones that are falling from YouTube cannot do the questions, right? So just the ones that are in the Zoom transmission, right? I apologize.
So questions are Q&As, and the questions are we see the questions, and in the end we're going to select, in the last 15 minutes, select questions from the audience to ask Jean. Jean, thank you very much. Greatest honor, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Lucas and Rubens and Humberto. It's a big honor for me, actually. The honor is mine, because celebrating the 60th anniversary of FGV is really something, I must say. So, you know, it's the foremost institution, not only in Brazil, not only in Latin America, but, you know, it's worldwide renowned. And that's very important, both for the students and also for the faculty, because there is also breakthrough research being done there. We would like to appropriate some of the names because I have lots of friends from Toulouse, including some who have spoken already, but, you know, you belong to Brazil and to FGV, of course, and that's very good for us to have you from time to time in Europe. As Ruben said, it's very important to have the values and the approach. Countries like Brazil or our countries in Europe are not easy countries to have academic institutions. And on top of that, economics is heavily debated, and that's not an easy thing. And you know, to create something like FGV, you need, and that was emphasized by Rubens, you need to have teamwork, both within generation and cross generation. That's absolutely crucial, and values, and you know, values, both ethical values and also values in terms of academic standards. And FGV has been extremely successful with that. So, you know, beyond the pleasure of seeing some old friends virtually, unfortunately, but you know, hopefully soon in person. There's also a big honor, of course, for me to be jump-starting this conference. Let me share my screen. Okay, so okay, I hope it's okay. Let's celebrate. Unfortunately, I don't have the bubbly with me. You know, I'm from Champagne, so the bubbly is very important. But yeah, that will be for another time in person. 60th anniversary, and that's very, very nice. Really, I'm very happy about what you have done. Most of the talk will be joined with Mathias de Watripon. By the way, another entrepreneur who has done wonderful work in his own place. But what I would like to do is to start with a broader introduction and then move on to more specific research that Mathias and I have been doing lately. So let me start with some introduction. And you know, if we talk about morality of markets, we first have to ask ourselves, what is moral in the first place? And you know, it's not obvious. There's a lot of discussion about what's moral and what's not. And that has been a philosophical debate for centuries and millennia. But the one notion is morality is about harm or externalities, I will say. And that's the way we formalize it most often in economics. Basically, and not only, I mean, philosophers also mentioned that, do no harm. It's very important. Things like don't pollute, don't commit crimes and the like. And this is a notion of morality, which is pretty universal, very similar across cultures, and pretty stable over time, I must say. But we have to acknowledge that it's also very restrictive, at least from the point of view of some other people who may not always agree with us. And there are a number of caveats. One is along the lines of this do no harm philosophy. You know, moral behavior has been documented to be highly fragile. So people are willing to be nice. I mean, think about all the experiments about the prisoner's dilemma and all those things, and also real life experiments, of course. But you know, if people have excuses to behave immorally, they seize that excuse. And now there are lots of papers which have documented this moral wiggle room. All the influence of narratives, you know, negative narratives, basically have an excuse not to do something that I should be doing. I'm going to leave that aside, but it's of course very, very important. The second thing I want to mention is that people sometimes think of morality in a much broader way than pro-social behavior. That the avoidance of offensive behavior, and that raises immediately the question about offensive to whom. So you go beyond. It may involve no harm to anyone. Again, you know, the definition of harm is complicated, but it includes violating conventions, not infringing on taboos, not generating disgust, feeling of disrespect for the other people's value or something like that. And the keywords here might be things like loyalty or duty or authority. And that's something we economists, of course, don't use to capture, and we don't capture that very much in our models because we think, for example, of authority as being a means, not an instrument, not a goal per se. Similarly, there is this notion that it's often in-group oriented. So lots of the people who promote those values as values of morality talk about being faithful or loyal to the family, to the workplace, to the country, to the religion, to etc., etc. And this is much more, much less stable and less widespread. Also, it can be widespread nonetheless. Across culture. So life insurance used to be thought as being immoral in the past because it was a bet on life. Of course, now it's no longer immoral. And same thing for gay marriage, which has long been taboo, and actually more than taboo, it's even it was even viewed as offensive to many people, whereas now it's much less so, of course, and at least in a number of countries. There are other countries which still have problems with it. So that's a difficulty, and I'm not going to deal with that. It's a much broader philosophical issue. What is meant by harm? I mean, if you disagree with me, for example, are you harming me? And the all stuff about the war culture, for example. I mean, do you include disagreement as doing harm to somebody else? I mean, I would not, but that's part of the broader view of morality. The economist Welton Shaw, the worldview in a sense, is by and large that incentives are key. So they are effective when they are properly applied. Of course, many of us have insisted on the fact that full incentives may be dangerous. Sometimes you need low power incentives for multiple reasons. So maybe you don't measure performance very well. That's in particular the case in teams. When there's collusion with a monitor, when there is capture, you may also want to have low power incentive. When there are repeated interaction, when you have multitasking, when you have adverse selection, all those are cases in which you may want not to use too much incentives because you leave rents and blah, blah, blah. So many of us in this room actually have worked on that. And sometimes we have even found example of crowding out. So crowding out is when you increase the price and you reduce the supply. So that may come about either because you have an informed principle, and the principle by setting an incentive scheme is basically demonstrating the lack of trust in the agent and demotivating the agent, or it can be due to what psychologists call the over-justification effect, in which if I give you money to perform a task, a pro-social task, then people don't know whether you're doing the task because you're a nice person or because you are a greedy person and you want the money. Okay, so you can even have, downward sloping supply curves. But by and large, if I think about, when I write economics for the common good and where other people do similar things, we still have in mind that incentives work. And I often argue in policy circle that you have to give more incentive often. Even so, I spend much of my career working on low power incentives. So of course, a number of caveats, but the basic philosophy, and I simplify here, is that we economists think that markets often fail, but properly regulated and with the right incentive, they are the key to economic organization. For example, Rubens was mentioning the climate change issue, but almost every economist thinks that the price signal is very important. The carbon price or cap and trade system is very important as part of the solution, and civil society often doesn't. Psychologists and sociologists don't have as much faith in material incentives, of course, partly for the reasons I gave earlier, because they undermine intrinsic motivation, they study the meaning of actions, But that's now part of the economics background too. So legal scholars, interestingly, they think that law is not just a set of incentives and sanctions, but it's also expressive law. So in a sense, the laws are also about reflecting the society's values, okay? That I don't think we have an issue with. And sometimes we have more difficulty with philosophers, at least with some philosophers, because their bone of contention is distrust of markets and more generally of incentives, because market is a specific incentive, of course. Many top philosophers, remarkable philosophers, have written books. I put two here, but there are many other famous philosophers who have written books with similar titles. Basically what money cannot buy or the like. But if you compare them, for example, if you compare Michael Sandel's, who's at Harvard, book with Deborah Satz, who is at Stanford, there are different approaches to saying, well, you have to pay attention to markets, and they're very different approaches, actually. And my own view is that economics is a moral and philosophical science, and therefore we have to ask what's wrong with it. Maybe that's wrong, something is wrong with us too, right? So I try to do that in economics for the common good, and I try first to argue that a number of repugnant markets can be analyzed in terms of externalities, including a very specific form of externality, which is image externality. Actually, there has been a number of court decisions talking about this image externality. So for example, in the context of prostitution or dwarf tossing, the idea is that the person may want to do it, but it degrades the collective image of women or small people or the like. But there are lots of externalities which give rise to repugnant markets. There are also internalities. Internalities is what happens when you don't optimize for yourself, in a sense, which is that you hurt yourself, maybe because you are compulsive or I'm sorry, impulsive. If you are impulsive, you may actually not defend your own best interest. There are things which have to do with non-competitive markets, with asymmetric information. I mean, some of the examples are almost ridiculous. So, for example, should there a market for France? Should there be a market for scientific prices? To take some of the example in Michael Sandel's book. But we all know that, of course, because of asymmetric information, if I pay you to be my friend, I will never know if you are really my friend, of course. And that makes sense. And the same thing, if I buy a scientific prize, it won't have any prestige anymore, etc., etc. So I refer you to the book for those arguments. Of course, that doesn't mean there are no repugnant markets, and there are real repugnant markets. But my own view is that when you devise policy responses, you must understand why you don't like it in the first place. If you don't understand the thing and you just express disgust, then you won't find the right remedy. You have to dig deeper and try to find out what's going on. And my moral postures, they are a kind of warning signal, but they should not be anything more than a warning signal. So if I feel indignant about something, then I should look into it and I should think about it, but I should not draw a conclusion immediately. People have, in the past have said, for example, sex between people of the same sex or different races is disgusting. And actually a number of laws have been built on that. Why? Where is the harm? I mean, you always have to ask yourself, what are my moral values? And then we get back to this first point. And then how does this indignation connect to my moral values? And that's what we need. We just should not be indignant. We need to think about it. And then also trying to reestablish faith in markets. Of course, many of us have worked on market failures and our whole lives, but you also have to ask yourself, okay, you don't like markets, fine, but what is the counterfactual? And the basic point is that markets always exist, whether you like them or not. And they take very bad forms often, like migration to untaxed, unregulated underground markets. So basically leaving the market to mafias and illegal operators. That's not an optimum, of course. And even if the market doesn't function well, or you don't want the market to exist in the first place, you should not basically ignore away the existence of a market. And of course, you have to think, what is the alternative? I mean, do you want to have waiting in line? That's pretty inefficient, as we have seen. You don't want people to freeze in the cold for one day to get some piece of food. Drawing lots, that has been used a lot in a number of countries, not great either. Do you want an administrative approach, priority groups, non-tradable vouchers, something like that? Or do you want corruption and favoritism, and you want a war and so on? So you also have to think about the morality of alternative institutions, because those alternative institutions also create incentives. And if you don't think about it, condemning market, even if we don't like them, is not a good idea. So now let me come to something which is much more specific, which is joint work with Matthias on the morality of markets. And I should say right away that we are still working on the paper. So those of you who have seen the December version of the paper on our website, we are going to try to produce a new version, because we are going to change a number of things in the paper. That presentation is basically halfway. I mean, there are more things to be done in terms of improving the paper, but I hope you find it interesting, as interesting as we do. So in that paper, what do we do? So we revisit a nagging question. Does the market weaken our moral compass? And I remind you that not only philosophers, for that matter, but also religious leaders, politicians, and the public opinion don't share a religion of the marketplace. And there is also some limited, I must say, but interesting recent experimental evidence on what's called the replacement excuse. So the replacement excuse is, if I don't do it, someone else will. That's a narrative which has been used many times. And one of the worst cases is basically Nazis who are working in concentration camps, and they were saying, look, if I hadn't done it, somebody else would have done it. And probably it's not wrong, but it's but that you see immediately what's going on. But also, when people sell weapons to dictators, for example, when countries sell weapons to dictators, they say anyway somebody else will do it. When you sell toxic financial products, same thing. Doctors who have sold opioids, vast amounts of opioids in the US, basically sold, said, okay, I can turn down the patient, but the patient will go somewhere else. Same thing with bribing. And a number of people who bribe, they don't necessarily like bribing other people, but they say, if I don't bribe, I won't get the business. And same thing with athletes who are in competition with others, and they say, look, I have to take illicit drugs, otherwise I will be finishing last. Okay, so the question is, under intense competition, such behavior may lose their moral object, basically, and become a mere cost of doing business. Okay, so in this paper, we study, in particular, one of the things we study is how the nature of competition affects the market's morality. So the nature of competition is going to be the market structure, of course. So think of that as being the number of firms and how substitutable the products are. But of course, it's going to depend, as we're going to see, on an overall ecosystem. So whether prices are fixed or flexible, you're going to tell me, well, the prices in general are flexible, but you have to reconsider that a little bit, because there are also interesting cases of fixed prices. So Taxis, for example, is a case in point. In many countries, doctors, notaries, and the like professions. You have franchising environments or apps where the franchisors, for example, have a fixed price. They are constrained to charge a fixed price, uniform price by the supplier. And then you have a bunch of markets in two-sided markets. I mean, Lucas mentioned two-sided markets, but one of the particularities of two-sided markets is that you often have zero prices. And many of us consumers, when we use a search engine or we use many services offered by Google, Facebook, and all the big tech companies, we don't pay anything. And this is actually much broader than tech. So, but there is a fixed price because there's a constraint, which is the lower bound. So that's it. Now, the outcome is also going to depend in general on whether cutting ethical corners lowers costs or boosts demand. So the cost reduction case will be the case where the firm employs child labor or pollutes, emits CO2, and that will be a case. That's a bit different because in the first case, the immoral behavior is going to increase demand. Basically, you try to satisfy the customer. Whereas the second case is going to reduce costs. So it's a bit different, as we are going to see. Increasing demand through misbehavior is different from decreasing costs through misbehavior. As you might expect, the social responsibility of stakeholder may matter, and also who you are going to compete with, because the competitive pressure will also depend on whether the other suppliers are ethical or not, whether they are for-profits or not for-profits, and the like. Okay, so the modeling choices, and of course, in this limited time, I'm not going to cover that much of that, but I've indicated with a star the baseline model. The baseline model, first, if you want to talk about the morality of markets, you have to discuss what the participant in this market view as being moral. Okay, so you have to take a stand there, and we know there are lots of different ways of thinking about morality. So we are going to take a specific stance, which will be social preferences. So basically, you internalize some of the welfare. But of course, there are other social preferences, like for Kantian preferences and whatever. And some deliver the replacement excuse, and some don't deliver the replacement excuse. But of course, I'm going to focus in the limited time on social preferences. But you should remember that actually what I'm going to do is also can be useful also to tell apart the different social preferences versus, say, Kantian preferences. Then you have to say who experiences some social responsibility in this market. So it could be suppliers, and that's what we're going to focus on. So that's called corporate social responsibility. But of course, in the paper, we add also the consumer social responsibility. They may want fair trade, for example. The investors may want to engage in socially responsible investment. The workers may want to work for a good firm, and so on. As I said already, there are two different monetary benefits from cutting ethical corners. The one is when you increase demand by catering to the consumers, in the case of selling weapons to a dictator, opioids, bribing, illicit drugs, and so on. But sometimes a firm behaves immorally on the cost side, so using child labor or polluting just to save on cost. Nature of competition, I've already discussed. There is fixed prices and there is flexible prices, so that will do both. Then we can have supplier risk aversion. We do that in the paper, but we're going to focus on risk neutrality. And I must say, whenever you have social preferences, you must assume somehow, and that's done in the entire literature on social responsibility, that there are no Pigovian taxes or insufficient one, so that there is still a wedge between the social arm and the incentive of the firms. There are lots of reasons for that, which have been discussed in the literature, like limited liability, absence of political will that we see quite unfortunately for carbon pricing, loopholes, corruption, costly enforcement, and of course the case where externalities are exerted abroad and it's hard to act upon. Okay, so that's basically the framework. I'm going to preview a couple of key results. So one of the things we do is not, is to unveil where does the replacement effect come from. We look at the case where cutting ethical corners increases demand, and when you have fixed prices, so when the prices are regulated or they're constrained by the zero bound or something like that, we show that ethical choices are strategic complements. So if you are more ethical, you have an incentive to behave more ethically as well. If I reduce my ethical concerns, so I'm behaving in an immoral way, I'm going to be more competitive because that's what the consumers want. And therefore, it's going to increase elasticity of demand. That's a standard elasticity effect. So you'll have a tendency to cut corners as well. So if I cut corners, then I'm going to take market share away from you. And then you have an incentive to react by cutting ethical corners as well. On top of that, if I behave badly, then you will have a urge to take market share away from me because I deliver a lot of negative social welfare. And that's a social responsibility effect. So you want to compete harder to take market share away from me. And again, you are going to cut ethical corners from me. So what we show there in that particular case of fixed price is that if you have an increase in competitiveness, so more firms or higher elasticity of demand, you end up with less ethical behavior. So that's a standard intuition in a sense. But we also show that this standard intuition is also fragile in a sense. Indeed, there is a very general result, actually even more general than I'm going to show you, saying that the competitive pressure is going to be irrelevant. There is an irrelevance theorem, which basically says even that you have more or less competitive pressure, that's not going to change ethical choices if prices are flexible. And the intuition for it is you go back to the case of fixed prices where an increase in competition induces less ethical behavior. But when prices are flexible, you have an offsetting effect. Of course, if you have a lot of substitutability, then you'll get lower prices in equilibrium. And that means that the markups are smaller. And because the markups are smaller, then it's going to be less tempting to undercut and behave unethically. And it turns out that very generally those two effects cancel. Then we look at supplier heterogeneity. I'm not going to discuss that right now, but because I want to jump into the model. But what I want to say is that you can look at the case in which the suppliers have different social preferences, or they have different corporate forms. So, for example, some might be for profit, and some other might be not for profit. And there are a number of sectors like housing, like health, like school, where you have competition between for-profit and not for-profit. So that's interesting from that. Okay, so, and there are some skip results. Okay, let me move on to the model itself. So you have a standard oligopoly market with suppliers and suppliers. They have marginal cost C, so I mean, the marginal cost might be different. So I took it the same here, but it could be different. USA have a mass of consumers with unique demand, so they have to choose between those suppliers. And we're going to start with a case where cutting ethical corners, so taking the immoral action, increases demand. So basically, the quality, and I'm going to give you examples in a second, but the quality is perceived as a surplus for the consumer, and we're going to call UI the utility that is derived from this action. So basically, you can please the customer. Your action is immoral in a way I'm going to describe, but you are trying to please the customer, and the customer appreciates that. We are going to assume that UI is in some interval 0 U upper bar, and as a welfare, in fact, small wi, which is per unit of consumption, which is a function W. It could even be a function WI. It's a function W of UI, which has a weird shape, but it turns out to be satisfied in all the applications we have looked at. Basically, it's single peak at some U hat. So there is some kind of socially optimal behavior, which is U hat. And basically on U hat, U bar being the ethical bottom, so that means the worst possible outcome in terms of welfare, it's concave, it's decreasing and concave, with actually the slope going to 0 to minus infinity at U upper bar. This is this part of the curve. I don't know if you see my pointer, but basically it's completely irrelevant, because in this range, by increasing U, you increase demand. At the same time, you behave more morally. So, I mean, it will have to be very perverse. You will have to be very perverse to be choosing in this range. So really, the relevant range is U hat, and remember, U hat is the social optimum, and U bar is the ethical bottom, the worst possible behavior. And when you increase U, you please the customer, but you behave more and more immorally. So in the paper, and I don't have time to describe that, we give examples satisfying those assumptions. So, for example, for externalities like pollution, the difference, basically, the externality is basically the difference between W and U, okay? So in the relevant range, the difference between W and U also, in the case of internalities, so internality is basically when you don't stand for your own best interest, is going to come from the difference in utilities between the long-term self and the short-term self. So, say, for example, the consumer is hyperbolic, is impulsive. The decision, the purchasing decision, is going to be made by the short-term self, but this is something like a drug, like an opioid, which will be costly for the long-term self. And the difference between welfare and U is the difference in utilities between the long-term self and the short-term self. And a third application we develop is product misrepresentation. There, you cater to the consumer by showing basically how great the product is, even if so it has some flaws that you are hiding. That may lead to excess consumption, inappropriate complementary investment, and so on. So again, you have a welfare loss. But if you misrepresent your product, of course, you have higher demand. Something which is going to be playing a big role is those net prices. So net prices will be the difference between the price and this utility, this surplus that you're giving to the consumer. Now, marginally, you might actually think about PI hat as being basically a price which is augmented or decreased by a function of what you offer to the consumer. Okay. We will say the consumer is socially responsible if I prime is positive. So the more unethical the firm is, the higher the demand, because basically it lowers the net price. The consumer is socially responsible when phi prime is negative. So that will be the case later on when the consumer, for example, doesn't likes fair trade, for example, doesn't like the firm to exploit people in the third world. Now, I mean, actually, it doesn't have to be a symmetric equilibrium. There is a demand function QI, which will be DI of the net prices, where P hat is a vector of net prices. And we'll define elasticity with respect to price, okay, the gross price, in the usual way. And the learner index, LI, which is a price cost margin, also in the usual way. Now, the standard case in economics is when you don't have social preferences. I haven't described those social preferences yet. But basically, if you try to maximize profit, the learner index is equal to the inverse elasticity of demand. And basically, you have the S equal bottom. So you try to please the customer. You choose U upper bar. You choose what maximizes demand in that case. Okay. Now, a key assumption we are going to make is that competition increases the elasticity of demand. Okay. So if I lower my price, it increases the elasticity of your demand. I mean, that's a standard assumption which is made in many models, so I don't think it's very controversial, but that's the thing. Now, let me come to social preferences. So we are going to assume that firm I, or the managers of firm I, or Dr. I, or whoever, has an objective function, which is basically the markup times the demand, so that's profit, plus alpha I, where alpha I is a positive number, which represents the internalization of welfare. And welfare is welfare as seen by the supplier. So W in general will be a function of the vector of net prices. Okay. Now, what W covers, there are multiple possibilities for internalization. That depends on what the suppliers think is ethical. So here's one example. So you might say that's the one which is developed in the current version of the paper. So basically, firm I has demand DI, then WI, remember, is W of UI. So it's basically the welfare that you deliver when you sell to the consumers. And then that's the welfare basically for other brought about by other firms, some of a J of WJ DJ. So we'll call that E, that's the ethical internalization. And some people, let me jump to the third possibility. Some people say, oh, no, not economists, but people say, what matters is my own customer. So I mark my consumers delivering social welfare. So I take a more narrow view of welfare, of ethical welfare as being WIDI, just looking at my own consumers. Conversely, you can look at a broader conception of welfare in which you take into account full welfare, because ethical welfare need not be the full welfare. If you have asymmetric firms, you may actually have a misallocation of consumers to firms. And that, of course, creates a deadweight loss. So, you can add the misallocation of consumers. So for example, in the hoteling model, you might not go to the closest firm. So there is a misallocation there. But it turns out that the only thing which is important is that W depends on the vector of net pricing, and then you can take whatever internalization you want. We look at two cases, one in which there are fixed prices. So PI is equal to P is greater than the marginal cost, and the case of flexible prices. So what we do, and I'm going to go a little bit fast through that, but what we do is basically look at Nash equilibrium among the firms. So firm I is going to choose UI in both cases, whether prices are fixed or flexible. And I wrote it down here, for example, for ethical welfare internalization. So basically, when you choose UI, DDI over DUI is positive. You increase demand because you please the consumer, is your markup, PI minus C. Then you change the welfare attached to your customers by W prime of UI times DI. You have DI consumers, and then you internalize a fraction alpha I of that. And that's negative term because you're going to be in the downward sloping part of W. And that simply means that if you increase UI, you feel bad about it because you internalize some of the impact on welfare. And then you have the elasticity of demand, of course, which is that you're going to increase your own demand and reduce the demand of your competitors. So you have a gain in market share with an impact. And of course, everything is going to depend in part on whether your WI is greater than the WJs or smaller. Okay, so when you rewrite this first order condition, I skip a few steps, you get basically minus alpha I W prime of UI, which is positive. So basically the marginal impact on the welfare attached to one consumer as you internalize it through alpha I times is equal to eta I times Li. Eta I is the elasticity of demand faced by firm I, and Li is a learner index, but slightly modified learner index. So the learning index is Pi minus C over Pi, but then you have to take into account also alpha I SI, where SI represents some social responsibility index. And that comes basically from this term here, the equal impact of the gain in market share, which is that you are going to displace customers, toward your own firm or toward other firms. So it all depends on basically you are stealing market share from, so the sigma IJs, which are the cross elasticities, but also the welfare which is delivered by your competitors. Okay, so that's actually very natural. That's so basically this social responsibility index is equal to some. When you increase UI, you gain market share, you steal sigma IJ consumer from firm J, and that's good from a social responsibility point of view if your WI is greater than your WJ. Now, you see that things are going to be quite simple in a symmetric equilibrium because all the WI on the equilibrium path, I insist, on the equilibrium path are going to be equal, and therefore SI in equilibrium is going to be equal to 0, and the learner index is going to be the standard learner index. And there is another case that maybe I'll come back later on, which is actually quite simple. Okay, so one of the first things you can do is to obtain a result, which I've already alluded to, is you would like to formalize a replacement excuse. If I don't do it, someone else will. And basically, what happens in this model is that if you are, so you are J, I'm sorry, I'm I, you are J. If you actually increase UJ, so you basically try to please the customer, then there will be an elasticity effect, which basically there will be more competitive pressure on me. And if I cater to the consumer, I will gain more market share because your move has increased my elasticity. Okay, so that's a factor of strategic complementarity. And the other is a social responsibility effect, which basically comes from this term SI. This term SI that I add here, yeah, that's the social responsibility effect. And basically, when you reduce WJ because you're trying to please the consumer, then you increase SI, you increase LI, and that gives you strategic complementarity again. Okay, now that's interesting. I mean, we certainly were not expected such a neat analysis of strategic complementarity. And it obtains for a number, I mean, all the examples I've given you so far, basically social welfare, ethical welfare, narrow ethical welfare, they deliver exactly that, at least the elasticity effect, but they always deliver strategic complementarity. Whereas if you think about deontologism or categorical imperative, you really don't get the replacement excuse. So that's actually interesting. So let's look at Lucas. I guess I have to finish about in 15 minutes. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So let me move on. So there are fixed price when you have fixed prices, so you cannot adjust prices for whatever reason. Then you get this condition. I mean, there's no optimization of a price. you get this condition, which is basically the condition I gave you earlier. Given the price P, you get the U star given by minus alpha times W prime. Here I wrote it in, only in the symmetric case, times the elastic demand times the Lerner index. Okay. Now from this equation, it's pretty easy to obtain the fact that the market is going to be more moral, which means that U star is going to be lower in this framework, if suppliers are more pro-social. I mean, that's kind of obvious, right? So if the alphas are higher, that's good for pro-sociality. The lower the regulated price, and that's very important because if P is lower, then that means that the stake is lower, and therefore there is less incentive in gaining market share through basically cutting ethical corners. And finally, when the market is less competitive, that's good for morality. So in a sense, that captures some of the objections people have to market. So, if it's less competitive when prices are fixed, at least, then it's going to make it a better world. Okay. So that's the first conclusion. So there's some grain of truth in what people who criticize market say, but only some grain of truth. And actually, whenever prices are flexible, you have very, very general results. So you see, I mean, when prices are flexible and you have the first order condition with respect to price of some IPI, then you get the standard equation. There is nothing new. Lerner index is equal to the inverse elasticity of demand. Nothing new. But once you remember this formula, where was this? Well, wherever it was, but basically you had the product of elasticity of demand times the Lerner index, and that means basically you get this condition for the equilibrium moral behavior, and you see that this equilibrium moral behavior depends on social preferences alpha, but just doesn't depend on anything which has to do with demand. So in particular, whether the market is perfectly competitive or totally monopolized doesn't change anything. And the intuition I gave you earlier, but it's worth repeating, is basically that if you have an increasing competition, then there is an incentive to basically, you gain more market share basically when you behave immorally. So that gives you an incentive to behave immorally. But at the same time, if you have more competition, you get lower prices, meaning that you have lower stakes and you have less incentive to behave immorally. And this is a very general result. It holds in asymmetric cases as well, actually, even so I wrote it only in this symmetric case. So that's actually very important because it's a huge caveat, and there will be others, but there is a huge caveat to this replacement excuse. Okay, so, and the proof is actually very simple if you think about it, because demand depends only on net pricing, okay? Now, the welfare function, I wrote it in the case of ethical welfare, but more generally, you have a welfare function W of P at. Now, if you keep net prices fixed and you maximize over UI, okay, so you replace the markup Pi minus C by Pi hat plus UI from this equation here. And you see that UI enters only in two places, here in the markup and here in the welfare impact on your own consumers. And both are proportional to DI, right? So basically that means UI doesn't depend on the demand function. So that's very important. It's true for narrow ethical mandate, it's true for full welfare, and so on. Okay, so the reason why you have the conventional wisdom with fixed price is that there's actually you cannot react through prices. Second caveat to the conventional wisdom is when you have cross-side benefits of an ethical welfare. Basically, here you have basically what using child labor or polluting does to reduce your marginal cost. So your marginal UI now doesn't impact the demand function with the only price is due, but it lowers your marginal cost. And again, it's easy to see from this equation that the optimal choice is UI is going to be independent of the demand function. Again, competitive pressure doesn't matter. And finally, let me say a few words in 5 minutes. I won't need much more on supplier heterogeneity. So we make some stronger assumption on heterogeneity. Also, for some of the results, we can relax that a fair amount. Basically, restricting the demand function to linear demand function, still a function of the net prices, but you get this. So what we do is we require financial viability. So we don't allow firms to make negative profits. We said that the price has to be greater than cost for demand side benefit or greater than marginal cost C minus U hat for cost side benefits. Okay, and we do two things. First, we look at what happens if people have different alpha I's, if they have different social preferences, or what happens when you have not for profit or for profit. And I'm just going to mention the latter. The latter, basically, if you think about the difference between for profits and not for profits, there are two potential differences. The first is that they recruit different people. And that has been studied a fair amount in the literature, that not-for-profits tend to recruit people who are more generous, more pro-social. This is actually well understood. What we do here is to focus on something different, which are different objective functions. So what does the not-for-profit status do in terms of outcomes? So we look at a model where we assume that everybody is the same S6 alpha. Of course, from the second bullet point, you might have different S6 across not-for-profit and for-profit, and that you could do very well in the model. But basically, you have for-profits and one firms which are for-profits, they charge their flexible prices. They basically have flexible prices, which are market prices. And the other firms are not for profits, and they choose a price which is marginal cost. So in a sense, it's like they have fixed cost, fixed price for demand side benefits, not quite a fixed price for cost side benefit, but there's still a flavor of fixed price, at least for demand side benefits. And here is the last proposition I'm going to state. The first part of the proposition is kind of straightforward. As you would expect, not-for-profits are going to behave more cyclically. So basically, U2 is less than U1 when cutting ethical corners increases demand. Okay. The more interesting and probably more surprising result is this two-sided mimetism. So basically, you look at what happens when competition between for-profits and not-for-profits becomes intense. And basically, each copies the other in a different dimension, because you have two dimensions. You have price and ethical behavior, right? And the for-profits actually are going to mimic the not-for-profits low prices, because the not-for-profits are going to sell at marginal cost. So they are going to charge low prices, and to keep market share, the for-profits have to lower their price. Now, what's interesting is that the not-for-profits, they mimic the for-profits unethical behavior. For exactly the same reason, they have, because competition is intense, if the not-for-profits want to keep customers, they have to please the customers. So basically, the for-profits have to reduce their price, the not-for-profits have to behave more immorally. And that tells you something about what will happen in a mixed market. And people often think about that in terms of market for schools or hospitals and the like. Okay, there's a little bit of empirical evidence going that direction. But of course, given this theory, we will need much more empirical work, and I will encourage this very much. So I'm late. Let me rephrase things very briefly the following way. The central result, which is a surprising result, is the relevance of the competitive pressure if you have either flexible prices or fixed prices, but more actions affect costs. But the replacement excuse is a valid excuse, and actually it shows up with a vengeance when you have fixed prices, and a bunch of cases where you have fixed prices. And that basically said that if you have socially irresponsible consumers, more intense competition will erode moral behavior. Something I haven't mentioned, but which is important, is that actually when you have socially responsible behavior, so socially responsible behavior wants the firm to behave more morally, not less morally. And there, it's kind of obvious, you just change the sign, which is that if you have more competition, that actually fosters moral behavior. Because you have more competition, then what's going to happen is that socially responsible consumers will have an easier time actually finding the firm they like who actually behave responsibly. So then you really get the fact that more competition actually creates more moral behavior. Okay, so let me finish by again congratulating FGV for a fantastic job. It's a great honor for me to be with you today, and happy anniversary. Thank you.
Jean, thank you very much for the very thought-provoking talk. There are a few questions. I think it's better to do one by one, right? So let me start with one question that came. In our model, consumers observe actions taken by the firm. Okay, so that probably makes more sense in some applications than others. So for example, when you think about like an application about how much a car pollutes, that's data that you can see unless it's whether on the other hand, whether a firm is selling a toxic asset, maybe the firm is somewhat like misleading the customer, right? Also, you gave an example of you like hiding, for example, how much sugar or how much fat there is in your product. So the question is, what would change in your framework if and also about how you would perhaps regulate it differently? I know you haven't touched it yet, but it's something that I'm gonna also ask you again in the next question. So if part of these moral characteristics would not be observable.
Okay, so in a sense, yes, we do cover all those things. In the Volkswagen case, for example, where they misled, it was a case of cost reduction. So you cut ethical corners, but that reduces cost. At the same time, that also misled consumers in other dimension because they wanted to, they misled regulators and consumers at the same time. So, and the consumers which were misled were those who had actually wanted pro-social behavior and wanted to have a clean car. Now, what you're asking is different. What you're asking is, what if people don't know the social concerns of the firms? They don't know the alphas, if I understand well. And
or even if don't observe you perfectly, for example.
Oh yeah, no, that's right. But they will always have some assessment. And actually the third interpretation in terms of misrepresentation of quality, for example, speaks to that exactly, because in a sense, the beliefs are the wrong beliefs. So you make them more optimistic about what the product is like than is really the case. So there's this part of the misrepresentation. Now, they may not know alpha I, so they may not know how socially conscious the producer is. And that can be, the theory can be extended that. It doesn't accommodate it for the moment, but it's a signaling game, basically, is that there will be some learning about the alpha I. And that's quite doable, because the firms will actually like to build a reputation, either for immorality or for morality. That depends on what the consumer wants. And that will be doable. I mean, that's quite doable, but we haven't done it, to be honest. By the way, it goes without saying that, Matthias, you can also answer questions, and especially the difficult questions that I miserably failed to answer. So,
Lucas, can I ask also a question now or later, or? Sorry.
Sure.
So if I understood correctly, so you are fixing the market structure of the model, right? So the way you model it. But another way to think about it is how you intervene in the market structure. It's another way to think about the regulation. So you thought something about it. So there is room to change the market structure in a way that would lead to better outcomes for the society in these terms.
So I guess
it's a broad question. I understand, but
this speech about competition being bad for morality, which is very, I mean, maybe not in the economics department, but by and large, it's very prevalent in civil society. And of course, lots of firms use that to basically fight competition policy and saying, no, you're obsessed by competition, and look, competition is not going to deliver the right outcome. So it's basically an excuse to basically lobby for protection from competition. So, you know, I would not want that to be a good excuse. But in terms of regulation, I mean, that raises interesting things. And something, by the way, we haven't done is the location. So you can locate more or less closely to your competitors and see what the implications are. It will be pretty easy to do given what we have done, but we haven't done it. Matthias, you want to add something?
Well, yes, maybe. Well, first of all, thank you for this great opportunity. But in a sense, and as Jean said, we are in the process of thinking about what are the key results. We have a rethink of that. So maybe I can try one thing. Indeed, it's irrelevance results that somehow, with flexible prices, which is basically the main case, with flexible prices, we have these irrelevant results. And we could, in a sense, say, look, you know, as economists, we like competition. We like competition policy because it reduces price cost margin and the like. Of course, you need to take into account fixed cost and the like. But I mean, there are allocative benefits and benefits for consumers with more competition. Well, the good news here is that it won't come at the expense of morality, which doesn't mean, of course, that we should just be happy with the equilibrium morality. We may want indeed to make sure that indeed companies do behave properly with respect to a number of ethical dimensions where society, democracy has to decide. But that in a sense, it shouldn't come through, I mean, it won't really work through competition policy. I mean, that might be, and so you may want to think of it saying, look, if it has an impact on competition, well, from an ethical point of view, don't really worry about it because there won't be a big effect. And then in those cases, of course, where we have fixed prices, example in health or with these zero lower bound and all that for apps, then basically if consumers are really moral, then competition will help, making the outcome more ethical. It's only in these cases where, for example, like in the opioid case, where consumers patients don't understand their true kind of well-being, that you have to be worried about having competition inducing, for example, these doctors or hospitals in kind of succumbing to these short-term impulses, and then you have these big problems. So I guess, well, that would be one way to answer your question. I don't know if Jean agrees.
No, I completely agree. And
thank you very much.
And you know, in response to Umberto, there is the thing is that it doesn't, of course, preclude the use of economic instruments. Actually, the start of the series says, you know, just like all the literature on ESG, you know, on social responsibility, is about saying, you know, for some reason the taxes are not there, or they're too small, and that's usually the case, of course. But you know, that doesn't mean you should not be using that. So. Yeah, and that doesn't mean that you should not provide the right incentive on opioids, on pollution, on whatever, on illegal drugs. But given that, you know, part of the social responsibility comes from the fact that there's a failure of the state fundamentally. You know, the old Adam Smith and Pigou view of the world. Basically, you have the market fails, so the government is going to correct the market, but then the government fails. And you know, at that point, you need to do something about it as a consumer, as a firm, as an investor. And there is this assumption, but that doesn't preclude, you know, policies which we work on.
So, Jean, another question that came, because there's something correct. It says pretty much the following. In many countries, firms are taking some actions because governments are not taking it. So firms are taking actions, for example, to decrease pollution of their cars. So they're taking some actions that are somewhat like, you know, you can think it like, you know, they're not profitable for them because they take into account this morality aspect. Would for example a properly regulated Pigouvian tax, say on carbon emission, change for example the that's beyond their model, but should change like the objectives of the firm, and then if it didn't, could you have perhaps like, you know, too much like, you know, morality, or like, you know, inefficient morality in this case?
Lucas, I mean, this is actually a difficult point. You know, I was mentioning the standard view of Adam Smith and Pigou is that you need a Pigouvian tax, you need to correct market failures, blah, blah, blah. That's what we think about. But you're asking what happens if you do that? Okay, so if you imagine that the carbon price is 100 euros instead of being 5 euros or whatever. If it was the right carbon price in a sense, do we still have an obligation to behave morally? It's not obvious, because you pay what you cost to society. You are made accountable for your action, and we economists will tend to say, okay, fine, then there is no more duty anymore because you pay for it and you compensate society for the cost you impose. But that's very much an economic view. My own experience in the last 30 years, where, you know, when I talk to policymakers, for example, or to friends who are not economists, about, okay, do you still have a duty once you have paid, you know, decent enough, high enough taxes? And they say no. So that, I guess that's what you have in mind. They say, no, it's not because you have paid that you are discharged of obligations. So even if you pay 100 euros or dollars per ton of carbon, you still must economize on carbon. I guess they have something in mind, which is another market failure, which is inequality or something like that. But they have this gut feeling that even if you pay the Pigovian tax, you're not off the hook, right?
Okay, Jean, I think we have like time for the last question, and right. So do you think that there could be like segmentations on morals? So some firms some firms focus on consumers with like some characteristics and some moral characteristics, and while other firms focus on consumers with different moral characteristics.
And the answer is yes. The answer is yes. You are going to have some segmentation in general of the market, and actually, when I talk about not-for-profits, I mentioned the fact that not-for-profits tend to hire people who are more pro-social at lower wages, by the way, because they get, that's actually interesting, because the people are happy to work for not-for-profit. So if they like the work of this not-for-profit, so they're willing to accept a wage which is actually often much lower than for-profit. So you have some kind of assortative matching of types and firms, and actually the firms may actually cater to different type of workers and also different types of consumers and so on. But they may also do a lot of greenwashing, to be honest. They may also spend a little bit, not because they care about the environment, but simply because they want to look good to the consumers and to the regulators. And we also have lots of that. But being less cynical, there's still scope for some kind of assortative matching between firms and workers. Yes.
Okay, Jean and Matthias, thank you very much for the talk. And
thank you so much, Lucas. Thank you everyone for the opportunity. As Matthias said, that was a great opportunity, and again, keep the good work. This is wonderful. So, Matthias.
Indeed, congratulations, and thank you for this invitation, and happy anniversary.
Thank you very much, John. Matthias, great to have you here. Great talk. Bye.
Okay.
Bye. 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 Take care. Bye. Bye.